This is Bandit, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
Debacle, yes, debacle is quite the right word. Yeah, I did. That was probably my proudest moment. I think on my first day, I probably sent emails to my friends saying, "You never believe where I am now. I'm playing video games and getting paid for it." Another one of those instances where a writer could actually have input into the game design, provided the game designer was open to that kind of feedback.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. John Michael Battaglia worked as a copywriter at Atari for about a year from 1981 through 1982, writing manuals and box copy for Atari 2600 and 5200 video games. He wrote the manuals for Atari 5200 Football, Space Dungeon, WaterWorld, Phoenix, and Adventure. He later worked at Catalyst, Nolan Bushnell's incubator for technology startups. This interview took place March 2nd, 2015.
How did you get started at Atari?
I was an extra in a movie called The Right Stuff, and my seatmate was playing hooky from Atari and told me that Atari was always looking for creative people, and I was at the time a struggling script writer, and she said, "Well, we're always looking for writers." So I sent a resume in and eventually got hired as a copywriter in the game department.
Awesome. Was you just sent it in through regular channels? You didn't get any help from your seatmate in the movie?
No, not really. I had to go through regular channels, and she was motivated because Atari had a policy at that time that if an Atari employee brought in another professional level employee, they would get a $500 bonus.
Ah, I see.
So she didn't pull any strings for me. She was just recruiting along the official Atari go and get talent lines.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. And we're still friends to this day.
Nice. So what did they have you do? I mean, what was one of your first projects once you got settled in? It was manual writing?
Yes, it was. My primary job was to write manuals and packaging copy for video games, the 2600 and then the 5200, Stella and Pam, so-called. And I think that my first assignment was football, the 2600 football, and then the 5200 football, and a few others along those lines. I know I rewrote the adventure manual. It was poorly structured when I took it over, and I restructured it and rewrote it. I think I did Space Dungeon. It was a lot of fun. I was only there a year because the video game industry was undergoing rapid changes at that time, and soon Atari collapsed. It was the fastest growing corporation in American history, and it was the fastest collapsing corporation in American history. But during that year, I had a lot of fun.
So you were there from June 81 to June 82, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So you wrote some manuals and you wrote some copy. You said marketing copy. So this is like box copy or?
Yes, the box copy, right, to entice people to buy the game once they picked it up in a store. You know, essentially saying you're going to be this person and this is your objective, and buy this game type of thing.
Right. So you had a paragraph of breathless copy to entice people that this is going to be the best, most fun they've ever had, right?
Exactly, along with illustrations that would give them an idea what was going on.
Did you write any copy for any of the computer products?
Computer products? No, I only worked on video games.
So what can you tell me about what went into writing a game manual? What were you thinking about when you were doing it?
Well, the system was, I worked in the consumer graphics department, and the writer had the most direct contact with the programmer, the game designer. And the typical way we worked was that we would meet with the game designer, and as he was developing the game, they would burn what are called EPROMs, electronically programmable read-only memory cartridges, that would be in stages. So they would be works in progress. And we would play the game as it was being developed, concurrent with the game coding itself, and we would learn the game aspects, the structure, and begin to develop the concept for writing the manual. Mm-hmm. And the structure of an Atari manual was such that you would have an introductory chapter that would indicate who you were as the player, the role you were playing, and you try and do that in a creative fashion. That was the most fun, to come up with a concept that would match the game design. And then after that role-playing was set up, then you'd go into the more technical aspects of how to play the game, what the features were, what the buttons are all about, and then there'd be a bonus chapter of how to get the most out of the game, tips. So the process was one of playing the game concurrently while it was being developed and getting it to the point where the manual was going to be a reflection, an accurate reflection of the concept, the fun of playing the game, as mm-hmm. well as providing the technical writing aspect of this is how you play the game. And then separate from that would be the packaging copy, which mm-hmm. would be written in a different style, and that would be more advertising copy. Right. So writing was a blend. It was creative storytelling in terms of the opening chapter, who you are and what your role is, what your objective is, what your mission is, technical writing, how you play the game, and then advertising copywriting for the packaging.
And it sounds like you had a hand in, this isn't my primary focus, but it sounds like you had a hand in the Sword Quest contest thing, maybe Debacle.
Debacle, yes, Debacle is quite the right word. Yeah, I did. That was probably my proudest moment. I'm happy with what I did there. I mean, I earned my money in those 24, 48 hours of saving what was going to be a debacle. Yes, that's right.
So this was a contest where people were supposed to like finish a bunch of get through the different games, and then they were flown out to Atari to compete in real time in a contest for the jewel-encrusted sword, I think, right?
Yeah.
So, tell me what happened.
Right. I don't know what you know about it as the background, but some marketing genius came up with this plan to integrate three companies: Atari, the Franklin Mint, and DC Comics. And the plan was for people to play the Atari game. There were 4 games. They were based on the elements: Air World, Earth World, Fire World, Water World. And you would play the game, and you would get clues at the end of the game, and you would write down these clues in a DC comic book, or you would send the clues in based on what you learned from the game and reading the comic book. You'd send them into Atari. If you got the right set of clues, you'd be invited to participate in a playoff. And those people that came and won the playoff would earn a $25,000 prize and the right to participate in the finals among the 4 winners of each of those games for a $100,000 jeweled sword. Mm-hmm. And the way that DC Comics came in was that the comic book was related to the theme of the game, and Franklin Mint was providing the jewelry and the sword encrusted design. And when it came to me, I was working on one of the games, and the marketing guy in charge of the project came to me and said, "John Michael, I've got these people coming in. I've got 7, I think there were 7 or 9 people coming in for the playoff, and you got to write down the clues to the game." And I said, "Joel, that's not a game, just to write down the clues." And he said, "Well, somebody's got to win within an hour because we're going to have lunch, and then there's going to be a ceremony." I said, "Yeah, but there's no fun in just putting down the clues. Then it becomes a race. It's not a game." "Well, I don't know. And he was just all afluster. And I said, "Well, let me see what I can come up with." Well, at the time I had a girlfriend who was an astrologer, so that night over dinner, I said, "Tell me about the zodiac and about the astrological signs." I had known something, of course, but I wanted to get her input. And the next day, when I went back to work, I ended up crafting a bunch of clues that played off of the concept of the zodiac, because the rooms, the game was basically designed so that you had to go from room to room, and the rooms were named after the zodiac, the signs of the zodiac, and they were astrological signs, and you had to drop any one of 16 objects or a combination of those objects in the rooms. And the game, in my opinion, was poorly designed because it was total brute force. There was nothing to tell you what object to put in what room. And when Joel says, write down the clues, what he meant was, tell them to put the amulet in such and such a room. And I said, no, that's not a game. We've got to make it fun somehow. So I used my writing skills, and I came up with a bunch of clever clues that turned the brute force game, so-called, into a true game. And you can tell that people were having a great time, because during the playoff, they were giggling, they were having fun. They knew their way to navigate around the zodiac, but now they had to read clues and interpret what they meant in terms of the actual game, so that somebody could actually win within an hour, and that's actually what happened.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. They ended up writing about it in the Atari newspaper. I didn't get a bonus, but I got an article.
Nice. So you only worked at Atari for a year. You ended up leaving during downsizing?
Yes. Yeah, the Grim Reaper walked through Atari, and essentially the attrition rate was when you were done with your projects and you didn't have anything on the board, you were going to be the first to go. So after a year, I had caught up on all my projects, and there weren't any new ones coming down the pike, so that's when it was my turn. And eventually everybody got the axe.
But you worked with Atari computers a little later, I believe. I'm not sure the order of things, but I know you worked at the Software Machine for a while.
That was a startup company, yeah. Yeah,
and I actually just interviewed Sean Hennessy the other day.
Oh, good. I was going to recommend you talk to Sean, yeah. I talked to him a month ago.
Oh, excellent. What did you do at the Software Machine? Were you doing any programming, writing or about Atari stuff? Or?
Well, Software Machine, as Sean probably told you, was a startup from a bunch of us Atari people. And Sean was brought on as a programmer, and I was brought on as Director of Corporate Communications. So I was involved in writing the business proposal in the beginning phases and writing the proposals for the game designs. But we never got any funding to get off the ground. But my role was in the communication aspect.
Okay.
Marketing and corporate communications, and collaborating with people like Sean regarding the designs.
Mm-hmm. And it sounded like you worked with Nolan Bushnell later at Catalyst Technologies.
Actually, all that was concurrent, because from Atari, I was only unemployed for a week, and I got hired by Nolan's PR guy to be his second in command regarding public relations over at Catalyst Technology.
Okay.
And when the Software Machine came along at the same time, within about a year, and initially we had our offices in the same building.
It was just downstairs, wasn't it, or something silly like that?
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So you're doing two jobs, running up and down the stairs, and
they were one after the other. It wasn't a conflict of interest or anything.
Okay.
But it was seeing the same people. It's just that we went to different rooms and worked on different projects. Catalyst was an umbrella company for a lot of venture startups that Nolan and his buddies had funded. In for a nickel, hopefully getting out for $5. What was their game? They were playing the stock market game, the venture capital game.
Yeah. What were you working on at Catalyst?
promoting the individual startup companies and acting as Nolan's PR person. I would say that working at Atari for most people was one of the most fun type of jobs you could have. I remember in the first week, might have been, okay, you asked about what was my first day like. I think on my first day I probably sent emails to my friends saying, you never believe where I am now. I'm playing video games and getting paid for it. I'm pretty sure I sent an email out like that. And that was my attitude for the whole year. They're paying me to play video games. Isn't this great?
Nice. And
for me it was a creative challenge. For example, when I worked on the Space Dungeon game, this was a collision detect game in which you had a so-called spaceship going through tiered chambers, and there would be objects you'd slide over to gain points, and there'd be obstacles that would come and try and blow you up. Mm-hmm. And when I went to the program and I said, so what's the concept behind this game? He didn't have any clue, because it was just, boom, you're dead, or great, you get points. So, yeah, I mean, truly. So I said, okay, well, I'll write a story about it. And Andrea Kuroda, the editor, after I ended up writing it, she said, this is like a movie script. And I said, yeah, that's what it is. It's a movie. So I basically wrote a treatment that became the introductory chapter, describing you're the commander of some spaceship and you're out in deep space collecting treasures of an ancient civilization, and you're going to bring them on board your computer and do your archaeological search for what this culture was all about. But watch out for these pikers. They'll come along and blow you away to astral dust. Stuff like that.
Huh. I find it fascinating that the programmer would create the game without really thinking about what was happening in the game.
Well, he had no story. He only had bump into this and this happens, or fly over this and it absorbs and you get points for it. But truly, he had no storyline, no literary sense at all. He only had bump and grind concepts. And that gave me free rein to write the introductory chapter.
Awesome.
And when I wrote the introduction to football, I used the fact that I grew up in Buffalo and mentioned the fact that it's cold in Buffalo, but you don't have to worry because you're warm playing Atari football.
Nice.
So I would always twist a sense of humor into it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fun to do.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And then for the 2600, Phoenix.
Oh yeah, Phoenix. Phoenix was cool too. Yeah, it was based on the mythical story. The bird rises from the ashes. That was the game concept, and it was a nice game, kind of like Centipede in a certain way. You had these things trying to knock your bird down, and you had so many lives. So the thing was to try and gain as many points and do it and let the Phoenix rise again.
Awesome.
One of the fun parts was working on the football game, the 5200 football game. In this case, I managed to develop a pretty close relationship with the developer, Jim Huther, and he had programmed the field goal aspect of the game to be random. In other words, you didn't know what you were going to do, whether you kicked from the 5-yard line or the 50-yard line. And I said, Jim, that's not rational. People need to make a decision as to what their chances are.
The closer you are, the better your odds, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And he understood that. So I undertook it on myself to contact the NFL and get the statistics for success ratios on distance versus field goal completion. And when I gave those to Jim, then he was able to program that into the game, and I wrote that in the manual so that people can know what their odds are from the 10-yard line versus the 30-yard line and so forth. So that made it more playable as well.
That's awesome.
It was another one of those instances where a writer could actually have input into the game design, provided the game designer was open to that kind of feedback. In this case, Jim was.
With you or with other people, were you aware of instances where the game designer was not open to that feedback?
Oh, definitely, yes. The game designers were rather egocentric. They thought they were God's gift to programming, for the most part. A couple of them were notorious in that regard, and they were so egocentric that they thought that they were the only one that could write the manuals. That was a disaster. What you found out is that just because somebody wrote the code doesn't mean they can also write the manuals. They were talented guys, but they didn't have the ability to translate their knowledge in code to write the manuals that would be understandable by a wide layman's audience. Mm-hmm. And we were writing for everybody from teenagers to older people. So the trick was to explain the game in such a way that people could understand it. But as is typical with programmers, and I've seen that not only at Atari but all the way through the rest of my career, programmers tend to write from an aspect of, this is what I put in the game. This is the feature of the game. This is the code that I wrote. And they don't have the ability to turn it around from the user point of view. When a consumer buys something, the consumer only cares about, what is it going to do for me? How do I get this done? What function does it have? And how do I make it happen? There are two ends of the candle. And people who write the code only write from the aspect of, this is what I wrote in terms of the code. But that doesn't translate into making sense to somebody who needs to use the actual software. It applies to games as well as to application software.
Absolutely.
So we had to write it from the aspect of understanding what the programmer put in the code and translate it so that it was useful for the players.
Awesome.
And that was a big difference in style and in structure from anything that the programmers would try and turn out when they thought they were going to control the game, basically, and that because they wrote the code, they were the only ones that understood it. But if that were the case, then none of the games would have sold. Right.
Well, I mean, in some of those early games, it really was a one-person operation. Sometimes they did the sound, they did the graphics, and they didn't want to cede control for any part of it, right?
Yeah, in small operations, but Atari was a very large and well-coordinated company, and there were a lot of talented people there. For example, the department I worked in, the consumer graphics department, we had writers, we had artists, we had graphic designers, we had illustrators. All of the talents of those people were required to bring the best out in the game and then to market it. No one person could control or have all of those talents. It's like making a movie. You need a collaboration of artistic, creative people working in a technological field in order to make it happen.
If you could send a message to the people who played your games back in the day, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Have fun.
Short and sweet. All right.
Have fun. Those games were marvels of technology when you consider that the programmers only had 64K of memory to play with, and they had to cram a lot of stuff into a very small space. Now, in fact, over the weekend, I carved out a partition on a hard drive, and I downloaded some video games, and they're 5 gigabytes, 13 gigabytes. I mean, my goodness, the art has developed a lot, obviously, and it's wonderful to see these images and videos and dialogue and things like that. But it all goes back to the original 64K design in which, what can you do in a small space? So the programmers were quite clever and quite creative in order to get what they got out of the equipment at that time. You got to give them a lot of credit. It all goes back there. And I think if people understand the history of the video game, they'll appreciate the evolution starting from there, the fun that you can have in the early games, and realize how far the industry has grown.
Great. Good answer. Thank you. All right. I think that's about all I have.
All right.
Thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Kevin.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.